The land stretched wide and empty, miles of dust and silence broken only by the sound of wind brushing against dry grass. Out there, near the edge of nowhere, stood a small ranch with a sagging roof and weathered fence posts that leaned like tired soldiers. It belonged to a man named Eli Turner, though few remembered his name anymore. Folks in town called him the Ghost Rancher because he lived alone, spoke to no one, and rode into town only when he had to. Eli had once been a man people talked to, not about. Years ago, before the fire, before the loss, he'd had a wife and a boy. But after they were gone, he stopped talking. He sold what was left of his herd, fixed his fences alone, and never let another soul cross his gate. Days turned into months, months into years. He learned to live with the quiet, or at least to survive inside it. Every morning he'd rise before dawn, feed the horses, and tend to what few cattle remained. He didn't keep a clock. The sun and the sound of the wind were all he needed to tell time. When he spoke, it was only to his animals, and even they seemed to understand the unspoken grief in his voice. His world had shrunk to the size of his land, a few acres of dust, a cabin with a tin roof, and memories that refused to fade. The townsfolk had long stopped trying to visit. They said he'd gone strange, that he'd rather fight a coyote than shake a man's hand. But truth was, Eli wasn't angry. He was just empty. He had built his fences to keep people out, but also to keep the past from creeping back in. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold. The sky burned orange and red, the way it always did before the cold settled in. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried and Eli tilted his head, listening. The land was too quiet that night, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't know it yet, but something or someone was heading toward his lonely ranch. And before the next sunrise, his world of silence was about to change. The sun sank behind the jagged hills, spilling long shadows across the dry earth. Eli was still sitting on the porch, his eyes fixed on the fading light. The coffee in his hand had gone stone cold, but he didn't notice. There was something out there on the horizon, movement, where there shouldn't have been any. At first he thought it might be wild horses or stray cattle, but as the figures grew clearer, his jaw tightened. Riders, 10 of them, their silhouettes dark against the blood-orange sky, moving slow and deliberate toward his ranch. He stood, squinting into the distance. His right hand brushed the butt of the revolver at his hip out of habit, though he didn't draw it. 10 riders meant trouble more often than not. The ranch was too far from town for casual visitors, and Eli hadn't seen company in years. He stayed still, waiting, watching how the dust behind them rose and shimmered in the dying light. The air grew colder as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves crunching against the hard ground. By the time they reached the edge of his fence line, the stars had started to poke through the sky. The riders slowed, forming a line near his gate. Eli's breath came out white in the chill air as he stepped off the porch. He could see them now, Apache. 10 of them, their horses thin and weary, their clothes layered against the cold. Their faces were tired, their eyes hollow from hunger and miles of travel. The leader, a tall man with a single braid down his back, raised his hand slowly in greeting. Eli didn't move any closer. He stood by the gate, one hand resting on the fence post, the other near his belt. The leader spoke first, his voice steady but soft. "We come with no harm," he said. "We seek only shelter, one night." The wind whistled between them. Eli's heartbeat was slow but heavy. He'd heard stories all his life, men who offered shelter and never saw another sunrise, raids that left ranches burned to ash. But looking at them now, he didn't see raiders. He saw exhaustion. He saw people who had been running from something worse than the cold. He didn't answer right away. The leader waited, patient and still. The horses snorted and stamped at the frostbitten ground. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "You picked the wrong ranch," he said. "We picked the only one we found," the leader replied simply. Eli looked past them into the night, no firelight, no torches, no sign of an ambush. Just 10 men and their horses. He exhaled slowly, opened the gate, and nodded toward the barn. You can keep your horses there. There's hay in the corner. The leader inclined his head. Thank you. They led their horses in quietly, their movements careful and respectful. Eli watched them as they worked. When they finished, the leader walked back toward him, keeping a respectful distance. My name is Nanton, he said. We've been traveling for days, no food left, no rest. We will not trouble you beyond dawn. Eli didn't respond, just turned toward the cabin. Fire's still going, he said. Come in before you freeze. Inside, the cabin glowed dimly from the fire in the stone hearth. Eli poured water into a pot and set it on to boil, his movements slow and deliberate. Nanton entered first, followed by 3 others. The rest stayed outside, huddled near the barn. The smell of smoke and leather filled the air as the men removed their gloves, their fingers raw from the cold. Eli didn't offer them seats, but they found places on the floor near the fire. The warmth hit them like a sigh. For a long time, nobody spoke. The only sound was the hiss of boiling water and the crackle of burning wood. When Eli finally turned around, he found Nanton watching him quietly. Their eyes met, 2 men from different worlds but with something unspoken between them, the kind of understanding only survivors recognize. You live here alone, Nanton said. Eli nodded once. That's right. For how long? Long enough. Nanton gave a faint nod, the corners of his mouth twitching upward, not a smile exactly, but close. The land keeps a man quiet, he said. Too quiet sometimes. Eli didn't answer. He ladled the hot water into tin cups and handed them around. It wasn't much, but it was something warm. The Apache accepted it with quiet gratitude. Nanton sipped his slowly, then looked toward the window. Storm coming, he said softly. Eli followed his gaze. The sky had turned a deep gray and the wind outside howled against the cabin walls. Reckon you're right, he muttered. Hours passed like that, quiet and uneasy. But as the fire burned lower, the tension began to fade. Nanton spoke of the land they'd come from, a place now barren and dry, where their people were scattered and starving. He spoke without bitterness, just weariness. Eli listened, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the fire. He'd lost things too, maybe not the same, but enough to understand. When Nanton finished, Eli leaned forward, stirring the embers with a stick. Ain't much here, he said. But what's left you can share till morning. Nanton inclined his head again, the light flickering across his sharp features. You are a good man, he said. Eli let out a low breath. No, just a man with a roof. Outside, snow began to fall, thick and slow. The wind softened into a hush, wrapping the cabin in silence. The Apache near the fire dozed with their backs against the wall, the warmth seeping into their bones. Nanton remained awake, watching the flames dance. Eli sat in his chair by the window, his rifle resting across his lap out of habit more than fear. He could feel the presence of others, real, living souls under his roof for the first time in years. It stirred something in him he didn't want to name. When the fire dimmed to a soft glow, Nanton spoke again, almost in a whisper. You lost someone, he said, not as a question but as a statement. Eli's eyes flicked up to him. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly he replied, yeah. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Nanton nodded, understanding more than Eli expected. Neither man said another word. The fire crackled, the snow thickened outside, and the lonely ranch, once silent and forgotten, was now filled with the steady breathing of men seeking warmth and mercy. For the first time in a long while, Eli Turner didn't feel completely alone. Something had changed the moment he opened that gate. He didn't know why he had done it, but as he stared into the fire, he knew one thing for certain. The quiet life he'd built was no longer his own. The morning came slow and gray, the kind of cold that bit through the bones before a man even stepped outside. Eli stirred from his chair, the rifle still resting across his lap. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the cabin smelled of smoke and damp wool. He blinked, remembering the night before. For a brief moment he thought it had been a dream, the Apache, the quiet voices, the sound of horses breathing outside his barn. But when he looked up, he saw them still there. Some were asleep near the hearth, others already awake, their movements careful and silent, like they were trying not to disturb the peace that had somehow found its way inside. Nanton sat by the window, sharpening his knife with slow, precise motions. The rasping sound filled the room, steady as a heartbeat. He looked up as Eli stood, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. "Morning," Eli muttered, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. "Morning," Nanton replied. His voice was calm, deep, the kind of tone that carried weight even when he spoke softly. Eli reached for the kettle and poured the last of the water into a tin cup. It was cold, but it woke him up. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The snow had stopped some time during the night, leaving behind a soft white blanket over the ground. His ranch looked almost beautiful again, clean, quiet, untouched. The air was sharp in his lungs as he took it in. The horses in the barn shifted when they saw him, steam rising from their nostrils. He grabbed a pitchfork and began tossing hay into the troughs. A few of the Apache men came to help without a word. They moved efficiently, their gestures respectful. There was no tension now, only an odd sense of rhythm, men working together because it was simply what needed to be done. One of them, younger than the rest, looked up at Eli and said, "Your horse is strong, good animals." Eli gave a small grunt. "They're survivors," he said. "Like me, I guess." The young man smiled faintly and went back to work. It struck Eli then how quiet everything was. The fear he'd felt when they arrived had drained away, replaced by something else, not trust, not yet, but understanding. These men weren't invaders. They were tired, hungry, and just trying to make it through another day, same as him. By mid-morning, the smell of coffee drifted from the cabin. When Eli returned, he saw Nanton stirring the pot over the fire, his movements slow and practiced. "Hope you don't mind," the Apache said. "We used some of your grounds." Eli shook his head. "Long as you left enough for tomorrow." The corners of Nanton's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You think about tomorrow," he said. "That is good." They sat together, the two of them, drinking coffee that was too bitter and too thin, but neither seemed to care. The warmth from the mug seeped into Eli's hands, and for the first time in years, he wasn't alone at his table. He glanced at Nanton, noticing the deep lines carved into his face, the quiet patience in his eyes. This was a man who had seen as much loss as he had, maybe more. After a long pause, Eli finally asked, "You said last night you lost your land. What happened?" Nanton's eyes stayed fixed on the fire. "The river dried," he said softly. "Then the soldiers came. They said we had to move. But where we moved there was no water. My people scattered. Some went to the mountains, some to the towns." He took a slow sip of coffee. "Now I try to find them. I follow the stories, the smoke, the graves." Eli didn't know what to say. His gut twisted as he stared into the fire. Loss was something he understood all too well, but hearing it spoken aloud from another man carrying his own ghosts hit him harder than he expected. "World's got a way of talkin' everything," Eli said finally, "and then expecting you to keep going like nothing happened." Nanton nodded. "The world does not ask, it takes." They didn't speak after that, not for a while. The fire popped, the wind sighed through the cracks in the window, and the quiet settled in again. Around noon, the younger men brought in some snowmelt and began cooking what little they had left, dried corn and bits of jerky. Eli added a few potatoes from his own stores without saying a word. They shared the meal in silence, but there was a kind of peace to it, a rhythm that felt almost like family. When the meal was done, one of the younger Apache began to hum softly. The tune was low and haunting, echoing off the cabin walls. It reminded Eli of something he couldn't quite place, something from before, when laughter and music had lived in this house. He didn't stop him. He just listened, staring into the fire, letting the sound fill the space that used to feel so empty. Outside, the clouds began to break apart and sunlight spilled across the snow. Nanton stood and stretched, pulling his coat tight around him. "We will move soon," he said. "The weather is turning." Eli glanced at the horizon. "Where will you go?" "Where we always go," Nanton said. Farther, Eli nodded. There wasn't anything to say to that. He walked to the window and looked out at the land, his land, though it felt different now. For years it had been nothing but dirt and ghosts. Now it was something else, something living again. He turned back to Nanton. "You and your men, you can stay another night if you need to." Nanton's expression softened, the faintest gratitude showing in his eyes. "You are kind," he said, "but kindness can bring danger." Eli frowned. "What do you mean?" "The townsmen," Nanton said. "They will see our tracks. They will not understand why we came. They will not believe we mean peace." Eli's jaw clenched. "Then I'll make 'em understand." Nanton shook his head slowly. "The world does not listen to men like you or me." Eli didn't argue, but the words sat heavy in his chest. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills again, Eli stood by the fence, looking out at the endless white stretching to the horizon. The Apaches were preparing their horses, tightening straps, checking saddles. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and fragile. Nanton approached him one last time, his horse already saddled. "You opened your gate," he said. "That means something." Eli gave a small nod. "A man's gotta do what's right, even if the world's forgotten how." Nanton studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small charm made of wood and bone. He pressed it into Eli's hand. "For your home," he said, "so the spirits remember the man who shared his fire." Eli stared at the charm, feeling its rough edges against his palm. When he looked up, Nanton was already walking away. The riders moved slow at first, then faster, until the snow swallowed them whole. The sound of their hooves faded into the distance, leaving only silence, but not the kind that hurt anymore. The charm felt warm in his hand, even as the cold settled back over the land. Eli closed his fingers around it, his breath rising like smoke into the fading light. The quiet had returned to the ranch, but it wasn't the same quiet that had lived there before. The next morning started like any other. The air was sharp and thin, the kind that cut through the lungs with every breath. Frost covered the fence posts, glittering in the pale light. Eli fed the horses as usual, trying to push away the strange feeling that hung in his chest since the riders had left. The silence felt heavier again, but not empty, just different, like the air was holding on to the memory of their voices. He found himself looking toward the road they'd taken, as if half expecting to see them riding back. He was carrying a bucket of water to the trough when he saw something in the distance, a plume of dust, faint but moving fast. His stomach tightened. It was too soon for traders, and the riders weren't approaching from the same direction as the Apache had come. He set the bucket down, the water sloshing over the edge, and walked to the porch, squinting against the sunlight. 4 riders this time. They came from the east, from the town. Even from a distance, Eli could tell they were armed. The man in front wore a tan coat, his posture straight and confident. Eli knew that kind of man, someone who thought the land bowed to him just because others did. When they reached the gate, the leader reined in his horse. "Morning," he called, his voice carrying a tone that didn't match the word. "We were told you had some company last night." Eli stayed still, one hand resting on the post. "I don't get much company," he said evenly. The man smirked. "That's so. Funny thing is, someone saw tracks leading here, a whole line of them. Looked like Apache horses to me." Eli's jaw tightened. "Wasn't your concern who crossed my gate?" The man swung off his horse, the others following suit. "Everything that happens in this county's my concern," he said, brushing the dust from his coat. "Name's Briggs. I keep the peace around here." Eli didn't respond. He'd heard of Briggs before, a rancher turned deputy, known for his temper and his grudge against anyone who didn't fit his picture of law and order. Briggs took a few steps closer. "You know the rules, Turner. You don't bring savages onto your land, not if you want to keep your place." Eli stared at him, his voice low. "They were cold and starving. They asked for a roof. That's all there was to it." Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. "That's how it starts. You give them a roof, they take your horses. You give them bread, they burn your barn. You really that foolish or just lonely out here?" The words hit harder than Eli expected, but he didn't flinch. "They didn't take a thing," he said. They were just men trying to survive, same as you or me. Briggs' smirk vanished. Don't you compare me to them, he snapped. They're killers, Turner. You know what they did to families out by Fort Mason, to women and children. Eli met his stare. I know what men like you did to theirs. The tension cut through the air like a blade. The two men stood frozen, the sound of wind and creaking saddles filling the silence. The other riders shifted uneasily, their hands never far from their guns. Briggs took another step forward. You've gone soft, old man, he said. Maybe you've been alone too long, maybe you forgot which side you're on. Eli didn't move. There ain't sides anymore, just people who have lost too much. Briggs spat in the dirt. You sound like one of them. He turned to his men. Check the barn. One of them hesitated. Briggs, do it, he barked. The men dismounted and pushed open the barn doors. Inside, the horses stirred, nervous from the intrusion. Eli's hand hovered near his revolver, his thumb brushing the worn metal. Briggs noticed. Don't, Briggs said softly, the edge in his voice sharp enough to cut glass. You so much as lift that thing and you'll regret it. Eli's pulse hammered in his chest, but he didn't move. The men came back out after a moment, shaking their heads. Nothing here, one said. Briggs frowned. Tracks. Headed north, day old, maybe two. Briggs kicked the dirt, then looked back at Eli. If they come back, you send word to town. You don't feed 'em, you don't house 'em, and you sure as hell don't lie for 'em. Eli met his eyes, steady and unflinching. I don't answer to you, Briggs. Briggs smiled thinly. Maybe not now, but you will. He mounted his horse and turned toward the trail. Men like you always do right before the world buries them. They rode off, the sound of their hooves fading into the distance. Eli watched until they disappeared, then exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. He felt the old anger rising inside him, the same kind that had lived there for years. The anger that came from watching men twist what was right into something cruel. He went back inside and sat at the table. The small charm Nanton had left lay beside the coffee pot. Eli picked it up, running his thumb over the smooth surface. He didn't know what it meant exactly, but somehow it steadied him. He set it back down carefully like something sacred. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower in the sky. The land was quiet again, but the peace felt thin, fragile. He couldn't shake the image of Briggs' smirk or the hatred in his voice. The Apache hadn't done a thing but ask for warmth, and yet the world still wanted to hunt them. As the sky turned red and purple, Eli saddled his horse. He didn't know why, maybe just to ride, maybe to follow the trail Nanton's men had taken. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but he pressed on, the snow crunching beneath his horse's hooves. He followed the faint tracks north, the only sign left of those who had shared his fire. After an hour, he found where they had camped, a small clearing near a frozen creek. The remains of a fire still smoked faintly, the ashes gray and soft. He dismounted, crouching near the ground, running his fingers through the soot. It was still warm. Something caught his eye, footprints leading deeper into the trees. His pulse quickened. He followed them, careful and quiet. A few minutes later he heard it, voices. Low, tired, but familiar. Nanton and his men. They were huddled near another fire, their horses tied nearby. Relief washed through Eli, but it didn't last long. Because behind the trees, just beyond the ridge, he saw something else, fresh tracks. Not Apache, hoofprints from heavier horses. More men, heading straight for the camp. Eli's heart pounded. He turned his horse around and kicked hard, riding fast through the snow, the wind biting his face. Briggs was coming. And this time, he wasn't coming to talk. The cold air burned against Eli's face as he rode hard through the snow, his horse's hooves pounding a rhythm that echoed in his chest. The wind whipped at his coat, tearing at his hat, but he didn't slow. Every second mattered. Behind him, the mountains loomed like dark sentinels, and ahead, the smoke from Nanton's campfire rose faintly against the gray sky. He could almost hear Briggs' words chasing him. Asterisk, you'll regret it. He didn't know what he was riding into, only that he couldn't let what was coming reach them first. When he reached the ridge above the clearing, Eli reined in his horse and slid to the ground. The snow crunched beneath his boots. Below, the Apache men were breaking camp, tightening saddles and dousing the fire. They looked tired, worn thin by the journey. Nanton was standing near his horse, his expression calm but alert. It was like he already knew something was wrong. Eli moved fast down the slope, calling out before he reached the edge of camp. Nanton, the Apache leader turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to the knife on his belt. But when he saw Eli, his posture softened, though his eyes stayed wary. "You should not be here," Nanton said quietly. "There's trouble coming," Eli replied, out of breath. "4 riders from town. They followed your tracks." The other men stopped what they were doing. The quiet fell heavy, the kind that seemed to make the world hold its breath. Nanton looked toward the north where the open land stretched for miles. His jaw tightened. "How far behind?" "Not far," Eli said. "Half an hour, maybe less. They're armed and they're looking for you." Nanton's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, resignation. "Then it is as I thought," he said. "The world cannot let a man rest, even when all he asks for is peace." Eli glanced toward the open field. There wasn't much cover, not for 10 men and their horses. "You can't fight them out here," he said. "Too exposed." Nanton looked around, considering. "There is a ravine west of here. We can take shelter there until they pass." Eli nodded. "Then move." "I'll ride back, try to slow them down." Nanton grabbed his arm, his grip strong. "You don't owe us this." Eli met his gaze. "Maybe not, but I can't sit and watch good men die just because someone decided they don't belong." Nanton studied him for a moment, then released his arm. "The spirits will remember you, Eli Turner." Eli mounted his horse again and turned back toward the ridge. Behind him, he heard the rustle of movement as the Apache packed what little they had and disappeared into the trees. The snow had started again, thin, cold flakes that fell silently from the sky. It would help cover their trail, but not for long. He rode until he found a cluster of rocks at the edge of the path, a place with a clear view of the open plain below. From there he could see them, 4 riders cutting through the snow, rifles slung across their saddles. Briggs was in front, his coat whipping behind him like a flag of authority. He looked confident, sure of himself. He didn't know he was being watched. Eli tightened his grip on the rifle. His breath came out slow and steady, misting in the cold. He could take a shot from here, scare them off maybe, but killing wasn't something he wanted on his hands, not anymore. He just needed to buy time. He fired a single warning shot into the air. The sound cracked through the stillness like thunder. The riders halted immediately, horses snorting and stamping. Briggs stood in his stirrups, scanning the ridge. "Turner," he shouted. "You best have a good reason for that." Eli stepped out from behind the rocks, rifle still in hand. "Go back, Briggs, they're gone." Briggs' eyes narrowed. "You lying to me, Turner." "They left at dawn," Eli said evenly. "Ain't nothing here but snow and ashes." Briggs let out a short laugh, the kind that had no humor in it. "You think I'm just gonna take your word for it? You've already been hiding them once." "I gave 'em food and a roof," Eli said, his voice hardening. "That ain't the same as hiding. They weren't looking for a fight." Briggs raised his rifle slightly, not pointing it yet, but close. "Every Apache's looking for a fight," he said. "You just don't see it till it's too late." Eli took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "You come any closer, Briggs, and I swear you'll regret it. You're not crossing this ridge." The 2 men stared at each other, the tension thick as the cold air between them. Briggs' men shifted uneasily, their horses pawing at the ground. "Stand down," one of them muttered, but Briggs didn't listen. His pride burned too bright. "You got no right to tell me what to do on my own land," he snapped. Eli's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your land, Briggs, it never was." Something snapped in Briggs' face, anger, pride, hate all rolled into one. He jerked his rifle up and fired. The shot tore through the air, grazing the wood beside Eli's shoulder. Eli ducked, firing back instinctively. The bullet hit the ground near Briggs' horse, sending the animal rearing and throwing him off balance. The other riders shouted, their guns drawn now, but none of them seemed eager to shoot. The standoff had gone too far too fast. Eli crouched behind the rocks, his heart pounding, snow spraying as bullets tore into the earth around him. He didn't fire again. He just waited, listening. After a long, tense moment, the gunfire stopped. The wind filled the silence again. Briggs' men exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, one of them spoke up. "We should go," he said. "Ain't worth it." Briggs, breathing hard, climbed back into his saddle. His pride was wounded, but his voice was steady. "You think this is over, Turner?" he called. "You think one old man's enough to stop what's coming?" Eli didn't answer. He just watched them turn their horses and ride back the way they came, their silhouettes shrinking against the pale sky. When the last of them disappeared, he lowered his rifle and leaned against the rocks, his breath shaking. He stayed there for a long while, staring at the snow where Briggs had stood. The trail would cover itself soon, but the memory of what happened wouldn't fade as easy. When he finally mounted his horse again, the world around him felt quieter, softer. The kind of quiet that came after thunder. He rode west, following the faint line of tracks left by Nanton's group. The snow was falling heavier now, erasing the signs of their passing, but Eli didn't care. He just needed to make sure they were safe. Each mile felt longer than the last, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. By the time he reached the ravine, the fire was out. The camp was empty. Only a single piece of cloth fluttered in the wind, a strip torn from one of their blankets, tied to a branch above the path. He didn't know if it was meant as a sign or a goodbye, but he understood what it meant. They were gone, safe maybe or far from it. Eli sat there in the snow, the wind howling through the trees. The world felt wide again, endless and empty, but not hollow. Something inside him had shifted. The loneliness he'd carried for years had cracked open, and in its place was something quieter, heavier, and more human. He didn't ride home right away. He just stayed there, listening to the wind, feeling the weight of what he'd done, and what it might cost him when the sun came up again. The snow had stopped by the time Eli made it back to the ranch, but the silence it left behind was deeper than before. The world looked frozen in place. The fences glazed with ice, the troughs crusted over, the porch steps slick with frost. His horse was exhausted, its breath coming in white bursts as he led it into the barn. Eli's hands trembled as he removed the saddle, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything that had happened. He could still hear the echo of gunfire in his head, could still see Briggs' face twisted with hate. He'd managed to stop them this time, but he knew men like Briggs didn't walk away for good. They came back, and when they did, they brought the whole town with them. Inside the cabin, the fire had long since died. The room felt smaller somehow, like the walls had crept closer in his absence. He hung his coat by the door and sat down at the table, the same place where Nanton had sat just 2 nights before. The small wooden charm still rested beside the empty coffee pot. He picked it up again, turning it over in his hand, tracing the carved lines. It wasn't just a token. It felt like something alive, something that carried meaning he couldn't quite understand but could feel all the same. The wind outside shifted, pushing against the cabin walls with a low moan. Eli set the charm back on the table and stared into the cold ashes of the hearth. He should have felt proud, maybe even relieved, but what filled him instead was an ache he couldn't name. The Apaches were gone, free for now, but the world they were running from would still be waiting beyond the next hill. He had bought them time, nothing more. A sharp knock startled him out of his thoughts. He stood, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his hip. Another knock followed, harder this time, impatient. He took a slow breath and opened the door. A young boy stood there, barely 17, his hat pulled low and his face red from the cold. Eli recognized him. He was Briggs' nephew, a quiet one who worked at the general store. The boy's breath came out in clouds as he said, "Mr. Turner, my uncle sent me. He says you best come to town." Eli frowned. "That's so?" "Yes, sir," the boy said, shifting uneasily. "He says there's talk. Folks are saying you were helping the Apache, says you fired on the deputy." Eli's jaw clenched. "That's a lie and your uncle knows it." The boy looked down. "I believe you, sir, but they ain't asking for truth. They're common for you." Eli's pulse quickened. "How many?" 4, maybe 5 to start, but others'll follow when they hear." The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet Eli's. "I thought you ought to know. You helped me once when my pa was sick. Figured it's my turn." Eli's voice softened. "You did right, son. Now go on home before they see you here." The boy nodded and ran off into the cold, his figure disappearing into the haze of falling snow. Eli stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the dark shapes move far off down the road, riders coming slow but steady. He knew he couldn't outrun them, not at his age, not with the kind of men Briggs led. He went back inside, loaded his rifle and set it by the door. The charm caught his eye again, its faint carvings glowing softly in the firelight as he relit the hearth. He thought of Nanton's voice, calm and steady. "You opened your gate. That means something." He hadn't understood it then. Now he did. Some choices couldn't be taken back, and maybe they weren't meant to be. By the time the riders reached the gate, the fire was roaring again. Eli stepped out onto the porch, coat buttoned, hat low, rifle in hand. Briggs was in front, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Didn't expect you to come so easy," Briggs said. Eli's voice was even. "Didn't expect you to send a boy to do your talking." Briggs grinned faintly, though his eyes were hard. "He's got manners, you don't. You shot at me, Turner. That's enough to hang a man in these parts." "You fired first," Eli said. "Town don't see it that way." Briggs gestured toward the others. "They'll say you were working with the Apache, that you betrayed your own kind." Eli shook his head. "My kind?" His voice rose, just enough to carry through the cold air. "What kind's that, Briggs?" "The kind that leaves starving men to freeze because of the color of their skin. The kind that thinks justice means whoever's holding the gun." Briggs' smirk faltered. "Careful, Turner." Eli took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "You don't want justice. You want power. And you'll twist God himself if it keeps you feeling big." The men behind Briggs shifted nervously, glancing at one another. Eli could see the doubt creeping in. Not all of them were killers. Some just followed whoever yelled the loudest. Briggs saw it too. His jaw clenched and he snapped, "You talk too much." He drew his gun. Eli didn't flinch. The movement was fast, reflex more than thought. One crack split the air. Briggs stumbled backward, eyes wide, his revolver falling from his hand. The others froze, their breath fogging in the silence. No one moved for a long moment. The snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. Eli stood there, rifle smoking in his hands, the weight of it heavy in his chest. Finally, one of the men dismounted slowly. He looked down at Briggs, then back up at Eli. "We're done here," he said quietly. The others followed, turning their horses toward town without a word. Eli lowered his rifle, the tremor in his hands finally showing. He watched them disappear into the white, their shapes swallowed by the snow. Then he turned and went back inside. The fire had burned low again, the warmth flickering against the cabin walls. He sank into his chair, the rifle resting beside him. His body felt old, worn, but his mind was clear. The world outside was still full of hate, still ruled by men who mistook cruelty for strength. But for the first time in a long time, Eli didn't feel powerless against it. The charm lay on the table, glowing faintly in the light. He picked it up one more time, holding it against his palm. It was small, rough, handmade, just like the life he'd built out here. He didn't know what the spirits Nanton spoke of truly were, but he knew what they would see if they looked upon this cabin now. A man who had once turned his back on the world had finally opened his door. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, steady, endless. The land was still. The air carried no echoes of gunfire, no shouts of hate, only the soft whisper of peace settling over the ranch. Eli sat by the fire, eyes heavy, the charm still clutched in his hand. The wind howled once more across the valley, and